Hello, everyone. I'm just going to wait a few minutes for folks to start connecting, and then we'll get started. It just takes a few seconds to get everybody connected, but I see people rolling in. It's St. Patrick's Day. I'm just pointing that out. I wore something vaguely that has a greenish tinge, but apparently it's a wonderful coincidence also because John D. Sullivan, aka Jack Sullivan, was Irish. So it all kind of comes full circle today. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone today to the annual John D. Sullivan Lecture. We're so pleased to have with us Camille Pannu, who's a professor at UCI, and Camille will be speaking about climate change and California's water justice future. I'm Susan Phillips, and I'm the interim director of the Robert Redford Conservancy for Southern California Sustainability here at Pitzer, and while my colleague, Director Brenda Sarathi, is on research leave. And since 2016, the Conservancy has brought speakers and panels to the college for this event, which is named in honor of Professor Jack Sullivan. Jack was a political studies professor. He passed away from cancer in December 2014. He was an intellectually engaging and challenging professor who helped his students to develop their critical thinking and analytical skills. And as a scholar, he was known for his work in conflict and negotiation processes and on policy analysis with a particular focus on environmental and water policy. And that focus is the reason that this series, which is also focused on water, is named for him. Jack was also deeply involved in the local community, and he served as the Natural Resource Director for the League of Women Voters in Los Angeles County. And this year, we're pleased to welcome Professor Camille Pannu to join our distinguished lecture series, along with Ava Tiller, a sophomore who is with Sunrise Claremont, who will be introducing Professor Pannu. Before turning it over to Ava, I wanted to extend some special thanks first to IT, for helping us with all the logistics, and also to Mary Sophos, Pitzer class of 1976, for her contribution to the John D. Sullivan Fund, which is intended to create public engagement around water in California and beyond. I'd also like to thank the Sullivan family, in particular Jackie Sullivan, as well as Sunrise Claremont, for the inspiring work that they're doing to combat at the college to combat climate change. And finally, I'm grateful to the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who is sponsoring today's lecture. Camille is going to give her talk for about 40 minutes or so, and we're going to be opening up after that for questions, maybe at about 4:45. The chat is open if you want to chat, but I'd like for you to put your questions into the Q&A so that we can track them, and feel free to start putting them in at any time questions occur to you. And we'll kind of chit chat for a little while after the fact and be ending today's lecture at about 5:10, 5:15, something like that. Okay, Ava.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ava, and I am one of the co-leaders of the action team at the Claremont College's Sunrise Movement. And we are currently, our project for the semester is working on a series of talks and lectures, and we are particularly focusing on climate justice. And we're really excited that this is our first talk. So Professor Camille Pannu served as the inaugural director of the Water Justice Clinic at UC Davis School of Law, the first clinic of its kind in the country, and is currently a visiting clinical law professor at the Community and Economic Development Clinic at UC Irvine School of Law. Her practice utilizes transactional legal tools to redress the impact of racial and economic inequality on access to clean, safe drinking water in California's low-income communities. Prior to joining King Hall at UC Davis Law, Pannu served as an Equal Justice Works Fellow in the Southern San Joaquin Valley, where she partnered with low-income communities to address poverty and racial and environmental inequality through community-owned green-collar enterprises. She then clerked for the Honorable Stefan R. Underhill of the U.S. District Court for the District of Connecticut and for the Honorable Richard A. Paez of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Pannu received her undergraduate and law degrees from UC Berkeley. Please join us in welcoming Please join us in welcoming Professor Camille Pannu to discuss climate change and California's water justice future.
Thanks so much, Ava. Take it away, Camille.
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you everyone so much for coming, for attending. Thank you to Professor Phillips for inviting me. And thank you to Ava for the generous introduction. I'm very excited to get to talk to you all today about one of my favorite topics. And I hope that by the end of this, you're excited about it too. Excuse me, I apologize in advance. I have a bit of a sore throat, so you may see me drinking water or popping a cough lozenge every now and again. And I also have to apologize in advance for my very adorable but very mischievous dog who likes to whine in the background from time to time. So with those disclaimers, let's jump in. So the structure of today's talk is going to be as follows. I'm going to try to give you an idea of where California's water comes from. You may know this already, and so I apologize if it's repetitive for anyone, but I think it helps to put us all on the same page, both as a state and regionally where our water is sourced. Kind of what the state of water equality is or water equity is today, meaning the social justice ramifications and who has access to water. And I'm speaking very specifically in the context of drinking water, but there is some back and forth between water supplies in general and how that's related to drinking water. Then I'll turn to how climate change is going to affect California's future water security and our ability to be resilient moving forward. And this is maybe a little bit of a big promise, but I'd like to offer some thoughts on how we could avoid a humanitarian water crisis, which is what will happen if we jump into the future without a really good plan for what to do with climate change and its effect on our water systems. Throughout the talk, one of the kind of animating principles of what I'm discussing is going to be that I hope you come away understanding that a lot of California water decisions are not solely engineering innovation based or solution based. A lot of our water problems can be assisted with the innovation of science and engineering, but part of how we got here was through a series of political decisions. And so I want folks to be able to think about this in more of a system structure where we talk about how law and money and politics and development of land all kind of interchanged or interwove to create the system we have today, and in many ways created the inequality we see today as well. So for a quick orientation, we mostly get our water through two sources in California for an anomaly of legal reasons. We talk about surface water and groundwater as if they were not connected, even though they are. So we know that 70% of California rainwater falls in this top third or perhaps even the top quarter of the state, but 80% of the demand is here in the South, with the lion's share starting right at Los Angeles. That's not surprising. Los Angeles is the largest city, although the heaviest user of water that's taken for human use in general is agriculture. Domestic supply is actually quite small as a proportion of the total amount of water that we appropriate or take out of the system. Throughout the year, a lot of where we store our water, in addition to storing it in reservoirs and whatnot, is actually in the Sierra Nevada snowpack. And so the snowpack becomes a really important source for us. California is almost constantly in a normal state of drought in that we have a dry season and we have a wet season. And we rely on the snow from the wet season to carry us through the dry months that follow as snow melts slowly and kind of replenishes our surface water systems. And so here's the infrastructure we built. So I think most folks, if you're familiar with California, will know this part of the state is not the most densely populated part of the state. There's certainly folks there and very rich culture, but the majority of people live on the coasts, and the lion's share of California's population lives in Southern California. So in order to irrigate what was essentially a series of deserts with some small river valleys, we built a lot of water infrastructure. So this is a map. Some folks will call it like the water highway because it'll show you how we moved water. And it's overlaid with the major hydrological basins and watersheds that the state is divided into. Despite the fact that the coast is right by the ocean, it doesn't have a lot of freshwater supply. So generally speaking, most of our fresh water that's coming from surface water is coming from the east and being shipped out to the west. And what we did is we had a complex series of really fascinating river systems through the federal water project, which we call the Central Valley Project for the most part. We started moving water from what are called the headwaters of the state that are up in this region. The headwaters are what primarily feed the Sacramento River. And so the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River become a really important source of delivering water. The other area where we pull a ton of water is from the Klamath River system, which is perhaps off map, but up here north of Redding. And the Klamath water system is an integral part of the state water project. So both of these projects had very different goals. The state water project's primary goal was to bring water from the north down to the south, primarily for the consumption of Southern California. And this was residential consumption. It could be used for irrigation, but at the time, at the time we built the project, there was certainly agriculture in the region, but it was brought down primarily to help facilitate residential development and development of the city of Los Angeles, which was quite small at the time, all things considered, and was small because it was contained within its water system. So it didn't have more people than what it could sustain. So to get over the natural boundary of what its water could sustain, we started moving water down primarily through the California aqueduct. And we also developed a series of dams and reservoirs to hold that water. The Central Valley Project, which is these kind of red lines that are all over the place, is a network of reservoirs, dams, and canals that are primarily focused on appropriating water from river systems toward farming. And so, although there were already river systems in the area, the Central Valley Project also irrigates, along with the aqueduct, irrigates a very dry and a not particularly arable or not very great for growing part of the valley, which is in the west. So the Central Valley Project's distributions are primarily to agriculture. It certainly also distributes water for drinking water consumption, but the lion's share of what it does is store water for agriculture and for irrigation. And then finally, because we're in Southern California, in addition to pulling a ton of water from the Klamath River Basin down through the aqueduct, we also are part of a complex series of multi-state agreements on how to distribute water that comes from the Colorado River. We are probably the last stop on the Colorado River train, and there's over 50 years of significant litigation between all of the states who are parties to this compact, but essentially they all work together to determine how much water is going to be allocated, who gets it where, whose water rights go where. And due to climate change, this has become an increasingly difficult issue to resolve, but also we've seen as a result of the Colorado River Project and the Colorado River watershed, we've seen significant growth in cities that I think we would say now with the benefit of hindsight, were not really designed to support that many people. So examples of this would be Las Vegas, Phoenix, really large metropolitan areas that did not really have a water supply that was big enough to sustain the populations that live there right now. But now I'm going to switch to groundwater. Although surface water is super important for how we distribute water and we kind of divvy up the shares, we rely really heavily on groundwater as well. This map is a map of the basins that were considered to be overdrafted, meaning we're pumping more than we're replacing, or were otherwise at risk of collapsing under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which was a really landmark effort to try to deal with the issue of people overpumping during periods of drought in ways that created a lot of negative side effects, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So these were the areas that were required to come up with sustainability plans. You'll see a lot of Southern California is missing. Part of that is because there's been a ton of litigation. So a lot of Southern California has already gone through this kind of planning process before this bill was adopted. But it's really important because over 40% of our water use is from groundwater. And in the context of drinking water, 85% of Californians rely on groundwater, at least in part, for their water supply. So even if you're buying, let's say, municipal water, you're buying water from your city, it's probably coming in part from a city well. And that's certainly true in Orange County, where I'm located. It's somewhat true in Los Angeles County, depending on where you are regionally. But groundwater is an important part of our water storage system. We store much more water underground than we do in any other area. And if you overpump, all of those underground storage capacities begin to sink. The land subsides, is what we call it. And when it subsides, it collapses these aquifers, these underground aquifers. And so we lose the benefit of storage forever. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, the greatest amount of overdraft and the biggest kind of subsidence has happened primarily in agricultural belts of California. So if we look at where the orange is, it's primarily areas that are growing food. So in Southern California, our primary sources of water are a combination of the Sierra Nevada snowpack, the Los Angeles aqueduct, which, as you can see, is nowhere near Los Angeles, but which was the subject of a really famous lawsuit, the Monolake Case. And if you've ever watched Cadillac Desert, this is what they're talking about, or Chinatown, the fictionalization of that story. We also receive some water through the Bay Delta system. The Bay Delta is where the San Joaquin River and the Sacramento River join. And we truck that water down, using State Water Project, like I had mentioned before, and the Colorado River Aqueduct. Something that's unique to the coast in California is that most of these areas, which have had issues with groundwater pumping historically, are now in a somewhat more stable position, in part because they do a lot of collaborative governance over their water infrastructure. And they also do a lot of water recycling, which is not for human consumption, but certainly for things like if you needed water to water your landscaping, for example. So for non-potable uses, areas in Southern California also engage in water recycling. And we have at least 2 experimental projects now that are trying to desalinate water, so taking seawater and taking the salt out of it. I have feelings about it. I think almost everyone who thinks about it or deals with it does. But there are some regions that have suggested that they'll be able to get around climate change through desalination. I'm not really on board with that, but that's okay. We need lots of ideas to kind of get here. So this is the backdrop of kind of where California water is. California also did something that's really significant, and it's very different from anywhere else in the country. So in 2012, we adopted the human right to water. We had actually passed the human right to water before, but it got vetoed. And so when it came back around and was approved, the governor had changed. So that kind of probably helped a little bit. But what it did was that California has this complex system of what we call beneficial uses. We go through an ordering and we say, here are the different ways you can use water. Here's the priority system, but we don't tell people what the priority is until they're in a fight. We try to figure it out through a variety of different cases that have interpreted the California Constitution. It has a provision about water, and also cases that were related specifically to surface water rights. And part of what makes those cases so difficult to parse is that, first of all, the prioritization is not always clear, and it's not always clear if there's a certain list of priorities in one place, if it's a list in another place. And so the purpose of the human right to water was to change the lens or the framework for how we looked at water. So water policy tends to be wonky in the state and tends to be contentious. I think folks use really technocratic language when they don't necessarily need to, and that helps keep a bit of a cabal around how water decisions are made. But the other thing that it does is that it encourages the best organized group to kind of make a run on water. So, this is kind of an agency problem, but we often talk about how environmental protection, for example, in law, we talk about how environmental protection is difficult because the benefits of environmental protection are diffuse. We all benefit from having a healthier environment. However, the person who wants to pollute or who wants to use a resource has a very focused interest and is very organized in a very different way than the general public tends to be. So California has done a couple things to try to cut against that. The first is that we had the famous Monolake case, which provided that surface water at least is held in public trust, which means that you cannot privatize it using the property rights regime alone, and that can't be the sole source of how we decide what's important to give water to. Case law had already told us that human use or domestic use of water was the most important and the highest and most beneficial use and should be protected. But as a practical matter, it wasn't being protected, and it certainly wasn't being protected in the same areas where we saw these priority groundwater basins. So for example, during the drought, we had literally hundreds of people who relied exclusively on what we call a domestic well. It's a very small well that's on your parcel of land as their only source of drinking water. And almost all of those wells went dry due to overpumping of these aquifers. So folks were essentially doing, I call it like the there will be blood method. So if folks have seen the movie, there's a point at which the main character says, "I take your straw and I drink your milkshake." And the other the other character is very confused by this analogy, but the concept is if I get a big enough straw, I can draw down the water such that your water is going to start moving over onto where I'm located. So part of what ended up happening is we had a situation where we had over 1,500 homes that completely lost water, for example, for over 4 years. And we had that kind of a crisis all throughout the state. It was primarily in rural areas, and the one good thing I think about the drought was that for the first time there was news coverage of this issue because it had happened it had happened before, and local government had told people, well, we're not going to really protect your right to have a well, even if you were there first, even if your well has priority in water uses, because we don't want to get involved with water decisions and fights. And so the human right to water in part was created to help arbitrate those disagreements and to shift our lens on how we think of water issues and how we think of who gets water and why should they get water and how much and what for. And so it said that it established that the policy of this state was that every human being, so not even every Californian, every human being in the state has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water that is adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitation. And the way that the human right to water is thought about or conceptualized in implementation in California is through these three kind of issue areas. So one area of water justice and of trying to figure out how to get people safe and affordable drinking water is to ensure that their water is high quality and that it's not contaminated. So there's a whole set of issues we have around kind of pollution policy, essentially pollution and water treatment policy. Then we have a whole nother bucket that's whether or not you can even access water. So that goes in our access Venn diagram. That can come from things like your groundwater aquifer sinking and all of a sudden your well goes dry, or it could come from periods where there's drought. And so the surface water allocations that are made every year are quite low. It could be that you don't have safe drinking water where you live, so you have to drive miles and miles to go buy bottled water, which is incredibly expensive. So you've now paid in time, travel, gas costs, and you're doing something that generally is not great for the environment, but is certainly going to be safer in most cases than drinking your tap water, although bottled water is not subject to the same requirements as tap water. Tap water has higher standards. And then we also have water affordability. So in a universe in which any technical solution was possible, it's kind of bounded by whether or not anyone can afford it. And so in many cases in California, we have very low income communities who have been kind of designed into place. They've been pushed into a region, denied services for a very, very long time. Their infrastructure is failing or non-existent, and building water infrastructure is really expensive. And so it makes their water incredibly unaffordable for them, although they're already paying what in the water justice world we call a triple tax. They're paying for tap water they can't drink because it's dangerous for them. They're paying for replacement water, usually at a much higher rate. And they're paying for the health cost of not having access to safe water. And of course, the human ramifications of not having access to safe water are enormous. First and foremost, your children can be taken away if you are not able to provide them with safe drinking water. Your house is not going to be easy to sell, and it will be devalued if it doesn't have access to safe drinking water. In some cases, you can't get loans to fix problems because of a pre-existing water problem. I worked in a region that had suffered a catastrophic fire, and no one could rebuild their homes until they could prove that they had safe and affordable water. So lack of water access becomes a significant burden for low-income communities and for all communities. But in California, it tends to hit people in different ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who bears the brunt of our lack of access to high quality water that is accessible and affordable. So this is a map that the State Water Board created. Their map is trying to track all of the systems in the state that have failed a public health standard. If you fail a public health standard, what it means is that you're serving people water that is not considered to be healthy or safe for them from a public health perspective. But not all contaminants are made the same way, right? So there's a big difference between if you have E. coli in your water, which in theory can be treated by boiling it, versus if you have heavy metals in your water, which cannot be removed through boiling, or nitrates, which become actually more toxic if you boil your water. So all these different contaminants and these different stars don't tell us really what the issues are. I can tell you that for at least this belt of the state right down the middle, the Central Coast, the Imperial Valley, the Coachella Valley, Inland Empire, and down here, sorry, that's the Imperial Valley, Inland Empire's all the way up here, Coachella in between. So all of those agricultural areas have significant amounts, or the systems that are there tend to have arsenic in their water, nitrates, which are essentially runoff from farm operations and manure, or from concentrated animal feed operations. And in some cases, uranium, and in many cases, pollutants that are related to industrial agriculture. So things that come from pesticides and rodenticides and all those other kinds of soil amendments or treatments that folks use when they're growing crops, but that might be quite dangerous to people if they're too close, and that can seep into their water or run off into their water sources and contaminate them. So perhaps unsurprisingly, when we look at who bears the burden where, a study that was conducted by Reuters right after the Flint, Michigan disaster, or this is several years after, but there was a lot of interest in evaluating and assessing how many other folks were being exposed to lead and how much of that was a story about racial inequality. And in California, what they found was that Black children who are living in low-income communities of California were extremely disproportionately more likely to be exposed to lead. Now that lead could have come not from their water sources, but they did pay special attention to failing infrastructure and pipes and any kind of degradation of old pipes that could result in someone being exposed to more lead. So this factored in water, and water was kind of the primary lens through which they did the study, although of course there's other confounding factors that could contribute to being exposed to lead. And unsurprisingly, California's African-American population is not very diffuse. So our African-American communities tend to be clustered. There's lots of historical reasons for why that's the case. But where they're clustered also shows us some hotspots. So this community, this zip code in Fresno, has the highest lead exposure rate for Black children. That zip code is a historically Black community in Fresno, and its population is about 60 to 70% African-American. If we jump down to, or if we look at Oakland and West Oakland, the area with the highest amounts of, or highest exposure levels are in East Oakland and West Oakland, which is unfortunately unsurprising. Those are both historically African-American communities, West Oakland in particular. I'm not sure how Eureka ended up on the map, but it has a very high level as well, although not necessarily as correlated with race. And of course, in San Diego and Los Angeles, there's a very high correlation of exposure to lead vis-a-vis race in African-American communities. And hopefully folks know this, but lead is a neurotoxin. It never goes away. It bioaccumulates, and it has profound lifetime effects that can really destroy someone's life before they even kind of get started. Similarly, this was an assessment of public wells. So these are wells that provide water to public water systems. And it was tracking where nitrate contamination was located. I forgot to include my arsenic map, but it looks almost exactly the same. So it's perhaps unsurprising that Latinx children Latinx communities and Latinx children tend to be exposed to arsenic and nitrates at a higher level. The Latinx population in California is very diffuse. We have a relatively diverse spread of where Latinx communities are located, even though there may be pockets, they tend to appear throughout the whole state. And it's unsurprising, but not great, that the greatest amounts of contamination from what I think many of us would think of as a byproduct of agriculture are, of course, in agricultural regions in the state. And arsenic is a very common contaminant in groundwater in these parts of the state as well, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley and up here. If you get into kind of the high desert area as well, you have uranium and arsenic. You have uranium up here as well. So when we think of how climate change affects water, I think it's really important that we think of climate change from many different angles. So the most obvious way that climate change affects water security or water access is through the supply. But supply is not the limit. Like, that's not the only thing that creates problems. And so, you know, some folks will advocate for the creation of more dams or more reservoirs. They'll say we should be storing more water. And it doesn't really grapple with the fact that even if you stored more water, our supply overall is going down. As temperatures go up, California's snowpack has shrunk significantly. This year, it's about 40% lower than it was before, and we had an unusually wet year at unusual times of the year. What we had a couple years ago is we had incredible amounts. I was living in Northern California, and we had tons of flooding. We had tons of rain. And rain is lovely, but rain is not a great way to store water. And so the snow levels were low, but our rain levels were high. And so we had this really bizarre circumstance where we were in drought, but we're having flooding, which just seems insane, but is a very common byproduct of climate change, because as climate change shifts the weather cycle and the water cycle, the timing of when water comes down and how it comes down and whether it can be stored or not stored becomes a really big issue. And so it also shifts when we are in drought, which kind of throws off how we've historically been able to manage it. The other thing that's really challenging with climate change, and it's not climate change exclusively that's done this, but generally speaking, we want what folks what civil engineers in this field will call water redundancy, which only means we want you to have more than one source of water, so that if one of your sources fails, you have another option. And in general, California does not have a lot of water supply redundancy in low-income communities who are facing water challenges. And even in communities that are not low income and having water challenges, we just don't have a lot of water supply redundancy. And so climate change makes that even harder. So during the drought, for example, people relied on groundwater because we didn't have as much surface water. Well, if climate change proceeds as it has been, even if we're able to curb kind of some of the most egregious jumps that have already happened, we're still going to see a lack of surface water, and we're still going to see problems in the next 30 years. The other thing that climate change does is it changes how contamination works for people. So generally speaking, the way that we determine whether someone can drink water and the way we measure whether it's safe or not is by figuring out how high the concentration of the contaminant is. So if your total amount of water starts decreasing, the concentration of the contaminant starts increasing in ways that become really dangerous. And we saw this happen as well during the drought. We saw folks beginning to fail water safety tests that they had been able to pass that they had passed prior to the drought, because the entire aquifer was shrinking and the concentration of contaminants was increasing. For folks who are coastal, we end up with a really big problem around seawater intrusion as well. So perhaps one of the biggest political fights, certainly in the Bay Area, is around the Bay Delta and how far into the Delta you can have, what salinity level, how salty can you be and how far. And typically the argument happens in a way that talks primarily about fisheries, who are important and I think kind of serve as a canary on whether or not that's a healthy water system. But it also has a negative effect on groundwater wells that are close to surface water sources. So groundwater wells that are close to surface water will often kind of have surface water leaching in. So if you have seawater intrusion, all of a sudden now you have a bunch of wells that have gone, that have been contaminated with salt. And although lead is a very scary thing to have in your water system, and arsenic is, and it's very expensive and hard to remove them, salt is the hardest contaminant to remove from water. Once you have salt in there, your costs of getting it out of there are really, really hard. And in many cases, it just completely destroys your water source. The other thing that we've seen happening with climate change, shifting kind of when water happens and whether it's available, is that we're also seeing shifts in waterborne disease pathology. So we're seeing waterborne diseases that we normally wouldn't expect to see as a result of our climate changing and of our environment becoming warmer and more hospitable to pathologies or to diseases that we associate with perhaps more tropical or more tropical regions. And finally, the other place where climate change wreaks havoc is on our infrastructure. So for better or for worse, we know that for worse, we know that climate change will create extreme weather events and disasters. But for better or for worse, having seen now Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Rita, the effects on the water system in Puerto Rico, even just now recently with the freeze in Texas and folks going for weeks without any running water or electricity and people dying of exposure, those extreme weather events have a heavy toll on the system, on the water infrastructure system. And we don't fund water infrastructure in a sustainable way. And so once your infrastructure fails, you're in a crisis situation. And that's what we saw in Puerto Rico. We had a lot of outdated infrastructure systems that had not been upgraded, had not received the funding to be able to do it, or had corruption in how the funding was appropriated. And that's not unique to Puerto Rico. Corruption in how water funding for infrastructure is appropriated happens everywhere in the United States. But it was a really good reminder that climate change resiliency is not only about the water supply and actual water itself, it's also about how we deliver water, and it can affect how we deliver water. Okay, I'm in the home stretch. So with that very dark and depressing series of kind of parameters, sorry. There's a couple of things that we could do as we go forwards. This is where we kind of end up in what I was talking about as like kind of the world of a political solution as opposed to simply scientific or engineering innovation. So one of the things that advocates from these communities did early on and have finally gotten through is that they've gotten the state to require all the different water systems that it is able to regulate to do drought planning and prevention. Meaning that we know whether or not someone's system is or someone's water is going to fail. We've seen it before. We have a lot more data after the 2011 through 2017 drought. Oops, sorry, there's a small dog knocking my laptop. And so we now know what to anticipate, which means that we could do a much better job or perhaps be better in how we intervene before droughts become disastrous. An example of this for a community that I worked with was the community of East Porterville. They're in Tulare County, California, which is in the middle of the state in the San Joaquin Valley. East Porterville is adjacent to the city of Porterville, and if you drive there for a while, you won't be able to tell the difference. You won't know that you've left the city. And East Porterville is almost exclusively on domestic wells. The community went dry. They have about 2,000 homes, 15,000 lost access to water. Their wells went dry. And when that happened, the state marshaled this really amazing intervention. And they marshaled all these resources to get people emergency replacement water, to fast track the process for getting them funding to build a connection to connect the city of Porterville's system to these individual folks. So now they were on a water system instead of a well. And they were able to do all that in part because we had passed a huge bond package that had funding for it in there in the middle of the drought. But one of the things that was really difficult about it was that it's even though it's often pointed to as a success, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to provide that. And it would have probably been significantly cheaper if we had done some strategic drought planning, knowing that East Porterville had gone dry in 2007 because of a mini drought. We probably could have predicted that they were going to end up in the situation they were in, and we probably could have helped people before it became a very dire situation for them from a public health perspective. And even though the project was fast tracked, it took over 5 years, and I think they finally connected the last houses that were supposed to be part of the project about a year and a half ago, for when their wells went dry in around 2012, 2013. So it's a long time to wait to not have running water or safe water. The other thing that California could do, and that it is doing in ways that I think are exciting and that I hope the federal government also supports, is that it can invest more in its infrastructure and its repair. Historically, we've spent a lot of money on repairing infrastructure that benefits the transportation of water, not always to residential areas, but we spend a lot of money on maintaining the state water project, for example, which we should. I mean, we shouldn't let things fall into disarray, but we kind of need an infusion. And this is true for most essential infrastructure throughout the state, whether it's bridges, whether it's roads. Most water infrastructure is beginning to reach the end of its life if it's been around for over 20 to 30 years. And so there's a really interesting and exciting bill that was introduced at the federal level that was put together through the People's Water Project. So if you're interested in kind of the political aspects of how you fund infrastructure, that's a really cool and interesting case study. It'll be interesting to see where it goes and how it goes. Additionally, in California, we created what's called the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, and it has an explicit race justice focus, which I think is really interesting and unique. So it focuses not only on low-income communities who have lacked access to water, it also tries to address the fact that many low-income communities of color in particular were deprived access to safe water as a series of political choices, and that was motivated or animated by historical racial discrimination and might continue to have racially disparate impacts because we're kind of seeing the legacy of those choices or decisions that were made earlier in time. I personally think we should significantly reconsider our water uses. It's hard to convince people to do this, but we have a shift in California towards what folks call a durable water demand. So for example, if you had to choose between growing certain row crops and growing trees are always going to be heavily water demanding. They're a long-term investment. And most of our agricultural decisions in the state are based on the global market for food. So farmers make their decisions, with the exception of very, very small farms. Most farmers in California are making their decisions based on where they could get the best price for their product on the global market for food. And part of that in the last 15 years has been a big shift towards almonds and other kinds of nut trees, which already existed in places like the San Joaquin Valley, but we've just seen a lot of very water thirsty crops being planted, I guess. And it seems like an odd thing to do at a time when we know that water supply is waning. And so I think we have to really think about how we're using water and how the allocation of water could perhaps be reconfigured. And there are certainly farm communities, particularly in perhaps more wet areas of the state, that do this. They get together and they think through, okay, how can we do this in a more sustainable way? Or is our current use something that we can keep up? And then they kind of try to negotiate. And a lot of the time that takes a very long time, but there tends to be more cooperation as you go further north, and I suspect it's because there's more water, but something to consider. And there are certainly some interesting innovations in water conservation happening, and water planning and crop planning. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that are happening in the agricultural sector that could be helpful for long-term water preservation and conservation. We should conserve. We're really good at conserving when there's a drought. As soon as a drought order is released, we all go back to our old habits, particularly in domestic water. So I think there needs to be kind of a bigger conversation about conservation in general. Australia has had some really interesting changes in how they deal with conservation of water because they've had to deal with catastrophic drought for over 20 years. I also think we should shift the lens of how we view these problems instead of thinking of them as an issue of how much pipeline do we have and how much pipe per capita are we willing to spend. I think we have to think a little bit more holistically about our decisions, and that includes our land use policies or other policies that created the problem that we're currently in. So I'm happy to talk about any of these ideas further. I want to make sure we have time for discussion though. So I'll take a breather so that we can do questions and discussion.
Camille, thank you so much. That was wonderful and super informative. And I personally have lots of questions. I encourage everyone who has questions to go ahead and put them into the Q&A. We have a couple of questions lined up already. So I'll start with the first one, and then Ava, if you want to take the second one. Okay. So arsenic is the most common but natural groundwater water quality issue. Is the most common natural groundwater water quality issue, but nitrate mitigation might be, but it might be co-linked.
Yeah.
Okay.
That makes sense. I understand.
Yeah, it's the way it's written is repeating. However, how do we partition who pays? My guess is taxpayers, since farming sources are often historic and historically permitted. Moreover, in the context of climate change, can we mitigate quality and protect groundwater when inputs might be declining?
I think it's a really good question. So I'll start with the first part about who pays. So this has always been, I think, the political struggle of how to deal with a sticky problem. So there was a proposal. Currently, we have the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. It's funded through general fund appropriations, which is not a good way to, or it's not that it's not a good way, but folks are always nervous about appropriating out of California's general fund because our economic reality can be very volatile, and the general fund is the first place people go when we lose tax monies for essential programs. It's also partially funded through the climate change reinvestment acts that we created and programs we created. The original bill suggested that there should be a tax on fertilizer and a tax on dairies, and the tax was built into their operation. So it wasn't on the fact that they existed. It was like a small tax added to the cost of fertilizer itself. It had a cap, and it was actually designed to cover the cost of nitrate contamination as it was understood at that time when the bill was being advanced. Agriculture consulted on the bill and seemed to be in favor. There were a handful of folks, I'm trying to figure out how much I'm allowed to say without it in my role as a professor at UC Irvine, but essentially it came down to politics, right? There's lots of different decision makers in the room. I think it was interesting that agriculture was willing to get on board to propose this. I understand the criticisms of why people were concerned about having agriculture fund it, because there was a worry that they would try to get out of liability by saying that they had paid into the fund. So as a result, what ends up happening is the taxpayer ends up paying for it, even though there's a very concrete industry that's contributing to it. So on the back end, I think what folks have been trying to do is a couple of things. So in Salinas, the regional water board there did an enforcement order, which was pretty fantastic in my opinion. And they acknowledged that, they were able to say, here are the folks who have contributed to the nitrate contamination. It's disproportionately affecting low-income Latinx farm worker communities in the Salinas and Pajaro valleys. You need to pay for their replacement water and to get them a well that's safe. And they're doing it. And it's a confidential settlement. And so I don't know what the details are, but I think it's safe to say that if agriculture was willing to pay for the cost in a bill, it was probably less than what they have to pay through an enforcement action and a settlement. So that's one avenue to think about is, could the state, the regional water boards, who are primarily charged with enforcement actions in their area, could they be more collaborative or thoughtful about how they're doing enforcement and who's paying for what? There's also an anti-degradation policy and an irrigated lands policy that were passed. And so there are more hooks now to require kind of regulation of farming. And California is one of the first states that started to regulate farming on water contamination issues. So I think there's actually quite a bit of promise there. I generally like to try to work with people with carrots instead of sticks, but it helps to have a stick sometimes. And then I think the second question was, how can we mitigate quality and protect groundwater? Okay. If you can answer this question, you will be worth millions and millions of dollars. Because right now what folks are doing is they're trying to do these for-profit water banks that are going to quote unquote bank water using surface water. And having read some of the sustainability plans that were proposed, From what I can tell, I've been calling it voodoo water like math because none of it makes sense. We know surface water is coming down. I have no idea where they think they're going to get extra water to like pour on the ground to let it sink in and replenish underground aquifers. I think it's a lot of magical thinking at the moment. And so I think the protection of groundwater needs to be a more rigorous conversation. It's a legally difficult conversation to have because the law of how we regulate water is dumb. And it's particularly dumb in California. We're the only Western state that doesn't regulate groundwater the way that other arid states do.
Okay, I can ask the second question. So this person asked, I was wondering if Camille could expand on her ideas around desalination plants and why she thinks there are problems around it, and just talk more about her thoughts on those and why they might not be the best path forward.
So sure, I'm happy to talk about it. And, big caveat is that absent technological innovation, my opinion could change. But at the moment, desalination plants are incredibly energy wasting. They take a ton of energy, and California doesn't have a grid that produces mostly clean energy. We have more clean energy than we did in the past, but we have fossil fuel based energy production. So essentially what you have is your climate change driven by all of this fossil fuel kind of related emissions, including CO2. So if you're upping the amount of energy you're creating or using, you're just contributing more to the climate change cycle, and you're not actually fixing the problem, which is that we have climate change and it's affecting our water cycle. So in my opinion, it makes the system worse. I know it's a very diffuse effect. Of course, it's not localized, but it's expensive. It could make the situation worse, and it doesn't grapple with the fact that are we really going to, what are you going to do with the salt? And are we really going to try to boil the ocean? Like, those are just insane concepts, or they're not insane concepts. I don't mean to be pejorative. There are places that do desalination because it's the only thing they can do, especially globally, but you do it when you have no other alternative. And so I just don't think it should be our first alternative, particularly because of the negative role it would have environmentally at this point in time.
That resonates so deeply in terms of, if technology in a sense created these problems in the first place, like to use technology to kind of write your way out of them. I mean, it's always a bit of a contradiction. We have several more farming questions.
Sure.
I have a couple questions as well, but let's go to the next one. Farmers are price takers.
Yep.
To change crop decision making can't be reconfigured on a large scale. In other words, they're just trying to make end meet. So a lot of farmland has become speculative, and land use is critical, but needs to be further articulated. What do you these are statements rather than questions, but, kind of begging sort of like the question of land use is really a key thing that the Conservancy is thinking about right now in our region. The shrinking of farmland is really critical here. We're losing farmland, and this is obviously happening all over the country, but because we have land here and we have a historic agriculture district, losing that farmland to development and logistics in particular is a very real problem. For me, I also just want to throw in, I think, piggyback on Mark's question about, the idea of nature-based solutions to climate change. So Governor Newsom had his, N8220 bill, these 30 by 30 calls. Biden is in on this. There's sort of a global movement around it. It includes working lands, right? And it includes farms as having the potential to kind of reverse this. So I think that might be part of the further articulation that Mark is talking about. Do you have any thoughts about either Mark's question or the stuff that I'm, bringing up about nature-based solutions to climate change, and whether you think that, farming can play a role in that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, farming is a really important industry in California, and I don't mean to sound in any way opposed to farming. I think, there's great dignity in growing food that nourishes people, and it's an incredible thing to be able to do, and we should compensate people fairly for it. Right now, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that are somewhat abstract that affect why we're stuck where we are. So in terms of the price taker aspect, it's true that they're price takers. A great deal of that is because of our global market for agriculture. A lot of the kind of efforts at local and sustainable agriculture will not overcome that, but could help blunt some of that to give folks greater choice. One of the biggest food deserts in California are located where we grow food, which is insane and unfortunate. And I think we could begin to kind of rethink about how we could support people in that. But I understand that you can't change like this vast neoliberal global market overnight, and you can't push people to do it, and that you have to be very thoughtful about it, and that we have farms of all different sizes, and the amount of volatility they can withstand is very different. And the reality is that the folks who are smaller are, if they haven't already been driven out of business, are very much at the verge of that. And that deserves a bit of compassion when we talk about different policy suggestions. With respect to farmland and farmland speculation, so a lot of the speculation is happening because people want the groundwater rights. So, some of it comes back down to water again. But I think, I think there's a lot that we should be thinking about when we think of land use. California finally passed a bill in like 2010 that required you to prove that you had an adequate source of water that wasn't going to decrease or otherwise diminish your neighbor's water for the first time. It didn't stop the growth of suburbs though. There's been tons of new developments that are in areas that clearly don't have water. And I just, it requires a little bit more buy-in from local government, frankly, because most land use decisions, even if they're mandated by the state, land use is local and land use decision-making is local. And so you have to be very engaged with your local government. And often if we're talking about the development of farmland, we're talking about county government in particular, which kind of operates in the shadows for a lot of folks. So yeah, and then finally, I think the last question was about the role that farms could play. Farms are currently doing a lot of innovation around water. I mean, they don't have the money to get more and more water either. And so there's areas where there's farming and folks are doing really innovative things. There's agroecological practices that happen in different regions that are really helpful. And so I do think that there's a role for farms to play in conservation, and they've historically played that role as guardians and as gosh, there's a very specific word for it and now I'm forgetting, as stewards of natural resources. And so I think there's a great deal of pride around that in farming communities, and I think that we should tap into that and support it. I think the part where it gets a little tricky is that 3 families in California control 70% of farmland, and they're major businesses and they don't live there, and it's not in their interest for anything to change. At least.
Sorry. And then Zoe asks, are there any water saving innovations in agriculture that you're most excited about and think should be applied widespread?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really cool actually tech innovations that are happening in agriculture related to water monitoring. And that includes real-time analysis of what kind of groundwater they have. And so there's some irrigation districts that are doing some really innovative and cool stuff. They haven't shared it publicly because it's all proprietary, and people are very secretive about groundwater data in California. I understand why they're secretive. I don't like that they're secretive, but I get why they are. But I think those innovations are actually really excellent, and that we should be thinking about how their technological innovations around monitoring, reporting, assessing the health of their watersheds, et cetera, could be scaled up or leveraged to other industries or to include other uses, especially in groundwater. I mean, agriculture almost like ahead of anyone else is really ahead of the curve when it comes to figuring out how to apply tech to groundwater.
I'd like to encourage people, if they still have questions, to write them into the Q&A for us. And I'd also like to shift the terms of the discussion just a little bit. Again, it's been marvelous and very enlightening. I'm really interested, and at the Conservancy, we're really, really deeply invested in regenerative agriculture and thinking about solutions for our region and, how that can make a difference. So this is wonderful for me personally, and I think for the Conservancy, just giving us a wealth of knowledge here and lots of things to think about. I want to talk a little bit more about you and about how did Camille Pannu come to be interested in these issues, and also just I guess thinking about, you've done a lot of community work, and thinking about how that's not the case with everybody who does policy. It is the case sometimes, and usually the people for whom those two things kind of collide it's easy to do policy without ever talking to community. I mean, it shouldn't be done. I mean, according to us at Pitzer College and you, I'm sure. But I'm just curious about your work and curious about, your particular practice of law, and also just curious about your background. So if we can talk about that for a minute, and then we can shift back to the question and answer.
Yeah, sure. So, like, what's the concise TLDR version of how I got here? So I grew up in Richmond, California, which is super post-industrial and very depressed. When we had the like 90s tech boom, and kind of the economy was growing under Clinton in like the mid 90s and whatnot, that did not happen where I lived. We were the murder capital of the country several years in a row. And for me, the big thing that affected kind of how I saw the world was the Chevron refinery, which is the largest oil refinery west of the Mississippi. And so that was kind of my orientation. I went to college and I was very dedicated to the idea of working on the systemic causes of poverty. And so I started kind of chasing different things. So my first theory was that education is like the biggest, lever of upward mobility. And it is, but you can't really get a great education if, you're getting poisoned with lead, for example, or like if the air you breathe or the water you drink is kind of putting you in a position where that's not feasible. Then I started working on juvenile justice advocacy because there was all this stuff around the school to prison pipeline. And the reason I never did environment was not because I wasn't interested in it, but because none of the programs that I looked at when I was an undergraduate were talking about environment and human society, if that makes sense, and how I really wanted to study environmental justice. I didn't know that was what it was called at the time. But most of our environmental programs did not do that. And so I just kind of opted out, and I was like a poverty studies kind of person. I was in that vein instead. But what I was studying was a lot of work around environmental devastation. Went abroad because I didn't get to study abroad in college. So my first job was overseas working on rural water in one of the poorest states in Kenya. And so it was super rural. It was all about waterborne diseases and infant mortality. I came back to the United States, and when I went to law school, what actually made the difference is, so he's now my coworker, but he was my supervising attorney, Bob Sullivan, over at the CED clinic at UC Irvine. So I was working at Yale Law School the year before I went to law, and Bob was there at the time, and I wanted to sit in on a lecture class on community development. And so I emailed him, and he said, "Oh, we're actually a clinical program." And so I was like, I'm not qualified. Like, I don't want to do it. And he said, "No, come over. No one's qualified. No one knows what they're doing. They're all new law students. You'll blend right in. It'll be fine. We have all sorts of non-lawyers from time to time." And working with Bob was really great because community development is a lot about working directly with communities to help them plan and transform what they want to see. And it's often working with people who haven't had access to, whether it was like financing or capital or even just decision-making authority. And it was nice, and it was interesting to me, and it felt very grassroots, and it was very local economies focused, which I found very attractive. And so when I went to law school, I had already decided, like, I want to be an environmental justice attorney. I want to do the kind of stuff I got to do with Bob. I had been a student organizer and a community organizer as well. But my life had always been like organizing on one side and then like nerdy life pursuits on the other. And what I liked about law, and what was good for me in law, was that it let my like nerd mind and my community justice mind work together. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to go to law school because law can be a very powerful tool for exclusion, or if you can give people access and help them navigate it, it can be a tool for empowerment and for shifting power. So I felt like all the structures of the world were written through law. And all the structural inequality I was seeing had a lot to do with law. And if we could get people to have power over, or if we could get people to harness their own power to be able to change those structures, perhaps we could get to more innovative places. So I thought I was going to sue refineries and work on community development. My first year, I had a professor, and she said, "Oh, you worked on water." And I was like, "Yeah, but I don't know if I'll work on it here in the United States because most of the really horrible water stuff seems to be happening on federal Indian lands and in tribal lands." And she said, "You should come with me to the Central Valley. We're going to go down to the San Joaquin Valley and take a trip." And I was like, I have cousins in the valley. I've been to the valley like over 100 times. There's absolutely nothing you could show me that I haven't already seen. Well, I was wrong. We went to a community that was a mile from Madera, which is where my cousins live. So I'd been past that community at least 150 times. I'd never seen it. I didn't know it was there. Very low income, primarily Black and Latinx. And they took us on a tour of their water system, and they were running their entire water pump off of a Cadillac engine. And that for me just blew my mind. Like when I was in rural Kenya where we didn't have running water or regular electricity, the way that we watched the World Cup was we went to a bar that hooked its TV up to a car engine. And I was like, that was in one of the poorest counties in the world. And here I am in one of the richest states, in the richest country in the world, and we have people who can't get water. It was just like profoundly disturbing to me. And so I 100%, I like did a huge 180 and became like a rural justice person. And like, you know, the rest is history.
Let me just say that Camille Pannu has worked with a project that is near and dear to our hearts at Pitzer, which is Huerta del Valle. So she was on the legal team with Bob Solomon and Carrie Hempel. That is still the pro bono law team for Huerta, is the program that you teach in now as well. So it's just really exciting to kind of come full circle. We can say we knew you when. Ava, do you want to ask the next question?
Okay, someone asks, how would you anticipate California and policymakers will prepare and react to the impending effects of climate change? In the case of Phoenix, groundwater extraction has become intertwined with the impacts of climate change, causing natural and economic stress for agriculture, housing, etc. in the region. How will runoff groundwater in Eastern California and its importance for the rest of the state change in the coming years or decades?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be pretty profound. So one of the things that is difficult is that, and perhaps this is not true for this group because this is a group that's particularly interested in these issues, I am embarrassed to admit that until my second year of law school, I didn't realize that my drinking water didn't actually come from the reservoir. I didn't realize that it came from like the Sierra Nevadas. I knew it did abstractly, but if you had said, what's your aquifer for your water supply? I would have said, oh, it's the, the Lafayette or the Richmond Reservoir. And people would have said, oh, okay. And I was like, yeah, it just fills up with water, which is not true. So, I think a lot of it is that most of us are not, I think this is true when we think of food justice also, right? Most of us don't know where our food comes from. We don't know where our water comes from, and we just turn on the tap and we expect it to work. And if it works, it must be okay. But I think one of the downsides of that is that we don't value the parts of the state that perhaps provide these kind of essential resources to us. So I lived in the San Joaquin Valley for quite some time. If I could do the job that I want to do there, I would do it in a heartbeat. And that's even though it was incredibly politically different from how I am and from what I believe, and things run very differently. Devin Nunes was my congressman at the time I lived there. So, it was different, but the feeling I got was that coastal California, especially like the Bay Area, LA, the kind of more concentrated metropolitan areas where there's a great deal of affluence among also poverty, I think they take it for granted. Like the 6 Californias proposal is a really good example of people not understanding the complexity of how our state is put together. And I think a lot of people treat inland California as flyover country or as backwards or as like somehow not worth listening to because it's politically very different than it is on the coast. And I think that's a mistake. And I think we miss an opportunity for engagement. In the context of policy, I think one of my favorite policymakers was Lois Wolf. She's since retired because she termed out, but she was a senator from the Central Valley, but from the northern part, and she was amazing. She's passed like just amazing amounts of legislation, and a lot of it comes from just treating people with some kind of respect. But I will say that for better or for worse, I think Professor Phillips actually asked me this. So I've worked on a lot of grassroots policy stuff with organizations that do grassroots policy, which for me was hard to imagine at first. I was like, how do you take something from the grassroots and make it a statewide effort? And they did it, and it was very empowering and very cool, and it was very much based in principles of community empowerment and community organizing. But their own elected officials don't listen to them. Like a lot of the bills that have passed because coastal policymakers are listening to people who are not their constituents about an issue that they are shocked exists. And, you know, the governor articulated that drinking water was like one of the most shocking things, and he was really upset about it. So when it comes to climate change, I think there's a lot of political will to do something there. I think California tends to be ahead of the curve on it in some ways, and sometimes we're a little behind the curve in other ways. But I think that if we want to continue to like really move the ball and think and talk comprehensively, we need to be engaging the eastern part of the state and the central part of the state with a little bit more humility and a great deal more compassion. Yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, I've certainly been in meetings with policymakers and felt like, you know, they're company men or women, you know, they're owned by a single industry or they're heavily influenced by something else. But one of the quotes that was very inspiring to me when I was a baby attorney was from Luke Cole, who kind of wrote a lot of the theory behind environmental justice lawyering specifically. So how to do environmental justice as a lawyer as opposed to doing it as a community member or an organizer. And he said, you know, there's two kinds of power. There's the power of people or the power of money. And so I like to think that, you know, if we invest in the power of people, we can get effective solutions passed and we can get more inclusive solutions passed. And from a policy standpoint, I mean, that's been happening. There's been, as a result of over 30 years of grassroots organizing and effort, in the last 10 years, California has passed over 30 bills related to water justice and to implementing water as a human right.
That's fantastic. We have time for just one more question. And it is appropriate, I think, to the audience here, which is, what areas does Camille think that students can be engaged in these issues? So how can students get engaged in this? And I'm talking particularly about undergrads, because, you know, we're all undergraduate here. So curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the great news is there's a lot that students can do. And it also depends on the role that you want to play in your advocacy. So for example, there's this, so Community Water Center is probably one of the best known water justice organizations in the state at this point. And Community Water Center will frequently host undergraduates, in particularly undergraduates who are juniors or seniors or right after they graduated. So they hosted a student who had graduated her senior year. She was doing a year of service and it was funded through a fellowship. And the report that she did for them was she looked up every single water district in California and tried to figure out when was the last time they had an election and when was the last time anyone had a contested election. And she found out that something like over 70 or 80% of systems had not had an election in more than 20 years. That's illegal, you know, like, but no one was watching. And she produced this really compelling report that was super helpful. That's a perfect example, if you're more academically inclined, of the kind of work that they could use. A lot of these groups that do the grassroots work and do policy advocacy have really good and sophisticated relationships with research institutions to help them figure out where the data is. There's a project that is kind of shaping up right now that's looking at California's administrator program. It's a way that the state wants to kind of bail drinking water systems out. And there's a lot of questions about democratic control and is that fair? But even at a local level, you wouldn't, even if you're not interested in policy or you don't want to do like a intensive report or anything like that, there's a lot of opportunities to get involved with community engagement and community organizing. Speaking personally, I think one of the best things you can do is spend as much time as possible with the community that you want to serve, whether that means living there or just spending like hours and hours and hours there, just developing relationships and understanding the kind of perspectives of the folks who are there. And then there's, of course, lots of internship opportunities and lots of organizations that do all sorts of work related to water justice throughout the state. So I think there's a lot of different places where folks can plug in. We need scientists, we need, you know, policy folks, we need organizers, we need every kind of skill you have. So don't feel like you can't get involved.
Yeah. I hope everyone will join me in thanking Professor Camille Pannu for such a wonderful presentation and for being our 2021 annual Sullivan Lecture for today. Thank you so much, Camille.
Of course, thank you so much for having me and for your questions. They were all really good and really thoughtful.
All right. I think someone has raised a hand. I'm not sure what that means. Oh, Jackie Sullivan has raised her hand. Jackie, I'm not sure how we can communicate with you, but I'm going to put it, I am going to, oh, there she is. Jackie, hello. Can you unmute yourself and show us your face if you can? Are you there, Jackie?
She's going to rejoin as a panelist. Give her 1 second.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, John.
And I've actually gotten you on my computer.
Oh,
Which
hi,
is-
Jackie, you're echoing. I'm wondering if you could do a single source for talking to us.
Yeah. Does that help? I don't know why that's happening.
If you mute your computer, you should be fine.
I'm sorry, say that again.
If you mute your computer or step into the next room with your device, you should be fine.
Is
That's
that
all-
any?
Yeah, that's way better. Thank you so much. That's perfect.
But anyway, I just wanted to thank the speaker. I thought that was Jack would have really been so interested in talking about those things, especially in terms of the kinds of things that ought to be, taken into account and solved. And the issue about the people without access to water is very disturbing.
Mhm.
And he was very much into social justice in terms of access to water and clean water and so forth. So, and I'm just glad that we had the lecture this year. I have to say that I really do miss Jack a lot about a lot of things, but one of the things we always talked about was water. In fact, once one of my students stopped me in the hall and said, "Does Jack talk about water at home too?" And I said, "Oh, yes, he does."
Oh my gosh, we miss Jack so much. He was a wonderful, larger than life presence on our campus, as were you, Jackie. So we're so deeply grateful you could join us today. And again, the magic of Zoom in this time, we're lucky that we can bring and convene a group, despite those limitations, through the power of technology. So I'm very grateful for
Well,
that.
I'm hopeful that next year we can do it in person again. I always enjoyed meeting the people that were doing the lectures. So
Yes.
thanks for letting me know and letting me.
Jackie, check your email because I just sent you a link. We'll do a little debrief with Professor Pannu after the conversation. So.
Oh, so get on my email.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
All right,
Thanks.
everyone. Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture and for your attendance today. Really appreciate it.